You again, with the Food Vision 2020, have moved yourself into the pole position on the follow-up to the United Nations Food Systems Summit. So I'm here to not only talk to you, but I look forward to learn from your engagement in the food systems transformation action of your country and internationally. I appreciate what Minister Hayden has said about the strong relationship between policy and science. So many countries are lacking that. I will talk to you about food systems thinking and the role of research and innovation, and especially the follow-up to the UN Food Systems Summit. You know, the summit was last year, but the next follow-up activity is already next year, and there is a process until 2030 along the lines of your Food Vision 2030. So how has the summit advanced food system thinking? What were main outcomes from science communities? How does the public and private research and innovation system need to act now? And I dare to make a few remarks on a preliminary assessment of the summit. The Food Systems Summit made it clear that transformative action in food systems is fundamental to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So the summit didn't come out of the blue. It came because of lack of progress to achieve especially the end hunger and the agricultural productivity and rural change agenda, the so-called Sustainable Development Goal number 2. It generated a range of deliverables. I just want to highlight 2 of them. There is a plan of action, a statement of action by UN leadership, and there was deep engagement worldwide in dialogues in almost 1,000 events and in more than 163 member countries. The world has never talked about food in its complexities at the level of intensity which we had the last 2 years. So you should imagine that entering the current food price crisis and food crisis is on a much higher level of knowledge. Well, let's come back to that, whether it's starting to pay off. That knowledge at country level and global level is helping us to cope with and to manage the current world food crisis. Speaking of food system, the scientific group of which my colleague Ismahane and I were members, I was chair of this, came up with this, after a lot of protracted debate, by the way, with this framework of how we need to look at food system. Food system is not just a phrase. It needs to be quantitatively tracked. It needs to be seen in connection to other bordering systems, the ecology and climate system, the health system, the economics and governance, and the science and innovation system. And the key building blocks are, of course, agriculture and food industries, markets, consumption, nutrition, health, and income and employment interconnected. The UN Secretary General's Statement of Action had these 5 points in brief. Nourish all people, boost nature-based solutions, advance equitable livelihoods, decent work and empowered communities, build resilience to vulnerability, shocks and stresses. That's of course very much the climate agenda, and accelerate the means of implementation. So not just wishful thinking, but invest in the means of implementation. So what were the main outcomes from science communities? I give you here this structure of, now it's not pointing, you see within a little red circle what science and how what science was supposed to do and how it was positioned in the structure of the summit machinery. It was placed for the first time for a UN food summit at a high level in the structure of decision preparations, next to champions, to dialogues, the UN task force, and so on. So there was a whole process with pre-summits, summits, we had science days, and so on. So, but the message which I want to give you here, the UN this time has dared to bring in an independent science body into the framework of preparing for the summit. The scientific group has released these 7 key science and innovation proposals for the summit. The scientific group, by the way, was 28 world-leading scientists from all disciplines, from all hemispheres, a diverse group appointed with the legitimacy of the United Nations. Let me briefly only mention the key points here. Number 1, innovations to end hunger and increase availability and affordability of healthy diets. De-risk food systems. Number 2, innovations for land credit and labor arrangements. Let's not forget, agriculture still harbors the majority of child labor in the world. Number 4, bioscience innovations, a key point. Number 5, innovations for productive soils, land and water, and to protect the agriculture genetic base and biodiversity. 6, this was not supposed to be only a terrestrial summit. So we emphasized sustainable fisheries and aquaculture and protection of coastal areas and oceans. Next week, we have a conference on oceans in the Vatican Academy, and 2 weeks later is the UN Oceans Summit. So we need to connect these issues. And last not least, digital innovations. Let me for a moment highlight 3 research findings which shaped the mindset in the context of the preparation for the summit. Number 1, we need to better understand the true cost of food. Food in the market, in the global market, is about $9 trillion per annum. But the so-called true cost of food, factoring in the external effects, the indirect effects, together with the market value, is $28 trillion per annum. About 8 trillion environmental externalities, so ecosystem services, deforestation, and so on, and about 12 trillion of externalities in the health sector. We need to bring down these externalities. We need to internalize them, to put it academically. Unsustainable and unhealthy food is too cheap. Sustainable and healthy food is too expensive. That's the huge dilemma which we have. I want to put up a second scientific insight which shaped the agenda of the summit. We estimated the incremental costs of hunger reduction. There is no silver bullet in this field. It needs a systems approach, as your food vision has it. There are some actions, such as agricultural R&D on the left-hand side of this marginal cost curve, as we call it, extension services, information communication technologies, female literacies, social protection systems, which are low cost, high impact, which can bring millions of people at low cost out of hunger and undernutrition. But we cannot get the job done only with these measures. There are measures which are more costly, and which need to be part of the portfolio, such as crop protection, such as integrated soil fertility management, trade policy, and so on. I don't want to run through these 25 plus measures, but the idea is important. We are confronted with an upward sloping marginal cost curve, but the bottom line is to get close to zero hunger by 2030 requires, according to these estimates, an additional needed investment of about $30 billion per annum. So that's not much money. Let me come to a third scientific insight. We need to understand the synergies and trade-offs of any policy action when we address the Food System Summit issues, the SDG targets. This table gives you red, yellow, and green colored information about each action. Let me just pick one. If we put adopting healthy diets high up on our agenda, you see it will be good for food availability. It may have price effects, so there is a red shaded color in the food access area. It will be good for smallholders, and it is unclear how it will impact on environmental outcomes. So we need to get serious on synergies and trade-offs, and for that we need to work with solid models. So these is a synthesis paper from the best modeling exercises on how to get the jobs done. Let me move on and highlight what we believe. Of course, this is a biased statement, as I was part of the scientific group, but your organizers have asked me to speak about, hey, what has come out of this scientific group work? I think these 4 points are very important to make. Number one, we established credibility within the science community, the social science and natural science. When I say science, I always mean the two. A credibility, and that was important for giving an evidence-based credibility to the overall summit. Number two, we mobilized the global science community. We had meetings with up to 3,000 participants. Ismahane was key in co-organizing that. Third, we established independent interaction with governments, private sector, farmer organizations, indigenous knowledge communities. So we had direct interactions with the world farmers, interactions, their youth members, and a series of 3 intensive interactions with the indigenous knowledge communities, who, by the way, for the first time, raised their voice very clearly in this summit. So it was not just a summit of nations, of government delegates. It was not just a summit of stakeholders and traditional interest groups, but the indigenous people claiming, hey, we are 400 million people, hear our voice, and it was, I think, heard quite clearly. What came out of this? Well, if you look into the statements of the 163 countries which have made statements on the summit, science, technology, innovation, and research, circled here, came out very high on their preference agenda, what needs to be our top priorities. And if you read the UN Secretary General's 5 pages of action, science and research is written all over the place. Well, that is output, but it is not yet outcome. Outcome, you will organize, for instance, for Ireland with your vision by getting things done. But for a summit, this was a strong impact. Well, this was a caricature painted by the caricaturist who was at the science days where we brought together 3,000 plus academics. You see from the left, the FAO DG, and then the Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed, and Agnes Kalibata was already mentioned, and yours truly without a beard on the right. So we try to communicate. That's what is the message. We need to communicate with the general public, because we cannot do science in the ivory tower. How does the public and private research and innovation system need to act now after the summit? There is, sorry for this complicated graph, but that is the institutional setup established by UN leadership to follow up on the summit with a so-called hub. And there is a little box for science, a science ecosystem of support. But I should highlight the music plays here at the bottom. Country-level implementation. Country-level implementation. That's why your strategy in Ireland is so important, country-level implementation. But I hasten to say we cannot do it country by country only. Countries need to learn from each other, the development cooperation, the UN agencies like FAO have a key role to play to connect countries' level implementation and mobilize the resources. The concept for that is we need to mobilize now science at the country level, at the regional and global levels, and connect the two. So I hope that the Irish innovation system connects to other countries' innovation system, not only in Europe, but globally, especially in the so-called global south. Let me come to my closing remarks on preliminary assessment of the UN Food System Summit and open issues. How do you assess a summit? Well, let's be fair. How about a little bit of benchmarking? There were 6 summits before. This is number 7. How does this one fare compared to the previous summits? I think pretty good. Pretty good. The previous summits were largely hunger summits. 1943, FAO was founded. The massive hunger created by the Second World War and Germany and world in trouble. I don't go through these summits now, but each of them had an impact. At least some significant impact was in 1963, the massive famines in South Asia. 1974, follow-up to Bangladesh famine, Sahel famine, food price crisis. And there were institutions created as a consequence, not just talk shops. By the way, if you flip in your internet to 1963, listen to John F. Kennedy's speech at that summit, a friend of Ireland, I believe. It's still a very good talk. Anyway, the Food System Summit was triggered by lack of progress in SDG 2, by the COVID, by the climate crisis, and now it was also, of course, taken over by the war in Ukraine. The positive outcomes are these 5. Political and societal engagement at scale. None of the previous summits has achieved that to this extent. 2, a food system focus, bringing in the environment agenda. 3, the science engagement. 4, an action agenda. And 5, national level implementation. The unfinished business are these 4, in my opinion. Strengthening the capacities for national level implementation of actions in emerging economies. I was delighted to hear the minister speak about capacity at least 2 or 3 times. Secondly, developing a strong finance agenda. That's where the summit failed, in my opinion. World Bank, IMF, regional development banks were not stepping up to the plate. But I believe action is now coming, with especially action also from the World Bank in the context of the G7 Alliance for Food Security, spearheaded by Germany this year, which is mobilizing billions. Number 3, establish improved science policy interfaces. So this must not be a one-shot event, science and policy coming together. And 4, facilitating synergies with other key areas: climate policy, COVID-19, trade policy, peace and security, and the current food crisis. A litmus test for the food system summit is how are we today dealing with the crisis, which the moderator already highlighted. The price crisis, the export disruptions, the security, and you know about the key role of Ukraine and Russia after the attack from Russia. The harbors blocked, 30% of world wheat trade is not coming out. But you see on the smaller graph here on the right, we had already price increase and price volatility in the context of the value chain disruptions in the COVID-19 period. We are confronted with governance challenges, and we should look to Ireland and others to deal with these complex issues. The UN established a set of committees and task forces. That's good. The G7 established what I just mentioned, the Alliance for Food Security, with the UN, not separate. That's new, that's good, and with G20. But there are superpower food dissonances which are very serious in this situation between China, Russia, the US, India export ban to be mentioned. Low-income developing countries did the right thing during the COVID crisis. They pushed up their social security spending and got into debt, deep debt. You know, Sri Lanka is into deep troubles now. So this was not creating debt for corruption reasons. It was for good reasons. We need to get into debt rescheduling. Civil society and NGOs provide significant initiatives. But the consumers in industrial countries, I can speak, for instance, about what's happening in Germany, want compensation for the high inflation, the energy price and the food price inflation. Well, we need to share the burden of scarcity in the rich countries. Of course, we need to compensate poor and low-income households in our countries. But if we are not sharing in the scarcity, we are further driving up food prices at the nutrition costs of the poor. And we are missing in this situation a continuation of a sound science policy interface. By the way, you see these graphs there. In the last 5 years, continuously food prices have gone up. Let me close by highlighting policy actions to address the global food crisis in 2022. Short-term actions are required. Keep food and fertilizer markets open. Avoid restrictive trade policies. It's not happening. WTO has not been able to do that. It needs getting strengthened. We need grain stock releases, including from those who have stocks, including Europe. Short-term changes in food production, we reduce bioenergy and the feed use, and social protection and nutrition actions in low-income countries. But the long-term investments must not be neglected, the investment in food system infrastructure and R&D. The word food system lives of innovation. 80% of productivity increases are from innovation. 20% are more resource use. That needs to be even a higher share. So let me conclude. These were my questions. I look forward to our discussion later on, and thank you for your attention.